So what we have are the big states, the dominant one, and then the contender states. And in the international economy, we as small states, whether we like it or not, we know those are the big boys that truly matter. Because if they were to fall off the surface of the earth tomorrow, their presence will be felt. So to start, I would like to hear from both ambassadors, those challenges you see or foresee for small states in this geopolitical shift from unipolarity to multipolarity. I know there are opportunities too, but let's stick with the challenges for now. Who would like to go first?
Go ahead, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. Let me, first of all, how nice to invite me and to share some of my thoughts. Thank you very much, Lily. It's been quite some time since I last. Yes, let me share some thoughts. I'm currently in Moscow. It's a very busy day, very cold day, and we're in lockdown. I might have some communication problems. I hope that my voice comes well. What you just said is all a deja vu of sorts. I think that in my childhood, because this is what I remember from the Cold War, it was basically my childhood. We were already a little polarized. We had our orbit. Some more Western, some more Eastern. Problem with the sound?
No, I can hear just fine, yes.
Okay.
Yes, we can hear you, Ambassador, don't worry.
Thank you very much. So, we already have, this is the sense of a deja vu. What is changing is this scenario, rather. Before it was very clear cut. Before it was NATO and its allies, and the Warsaw Pact and its allies. And there was a sort of gray area which was the non-aligned movement, which I think since then has lost a lot of its influence, the non-aligned movement, if it ever had it. Now we're seeing sort of the pole position where we are starting to see the gathering of the alignment. And where do we fit in all this? Now let me tell you from experience, we are victims of our size. We are not victims of our policies. At face value, I strongly feel that we are victims of our size because we start with a deficit. Our support is taken as a matter of fact. Our support is taken for granted. And we invest per capita in our political policies, in our diplomatic efforts. We invest much more than the bigger countries. But our efforts are not always rewarded. We have to work so much harder to advance our interests than the big countries. And often the big countries take us for granted. They take us for granted that we will fall in line. And now again we find ourselves in this starting point, whom are we going to support? Some argue values, some argue security, and so on and so forth. But there is something, if there is a message I can impart. You see, throughout my career, I have found that if I can call it the silver lining, what matters really is not the size of the country. What matters are the size of the idea. And this never then today these matter. Our ideas matter more than anything else. Now we are a little bit at fault because we allow ourselves to be seduced politically by the bigger countries. We want to be in the companies of the bigger countries. I think this is very natural. It happens in all walks of life, even in politics. We do not often, although a lot of our political interests converge as small countries, we somehow still gravitate towards the bigger countries. So right now, the COP happening. We hear the voices of the bigger countries, and I think we do not coordinate enough between us. Which is stupid, right? Because I think we should be more cohesive. But we still don't do it. And this has been, I've seen it over and over and over again. Why? Because first of all, I don't think we know each other well. I think we have sympathy for each other, but we still favor other centers of gravity. And because we cannot give to each other what these other centers of gravity can give us, which is not always the case, but at least the promise is there. So this is a very important aspect. Now, in the past, we have sold our assets politically, I think relatively easy and cheap, politically cheap, I think. I think in today's world, and the way it is already defined, the geopolitics is inseparable from tech, from high tech. In the past, the bigger countries needed a presence, which they used to be called bases. Nowadays, they do not need bases as much, I believe. But I think they need a foothold in our geography. Because today the operations are no longer massive what it used to be. Today it is internet, it's drones, it's so on and so forth.
Thank you, Clive. Let me pause you right there. Bilahari, that was very candid sharing from Clive. I want to know if you have anything to add with regards to challenges faced by small countries in this geopolitical shift from unipolarity to multipolarity. We'll just talk about the challenges for now.
Okay, I think. Go ahead, Ambassador. Go ahead, Ambassador.
We have a lot of challenges because, at least let me speak for my country. We have a constitution of neutrality. But again, we are going to find ourselves pulled from every side to support one bloc or one influence from another. When in fact, we should not be in this position. We should be on the other side. We should be asking the question. And I think this is going to be an important reality because, unfortunately, real politics is that if you're not with us, you're against us. And this is going to be our main challenge with its consequences. Thank you.
Clive, I just want to add to that, Clive. You know who else talks like that? If you're not for us, you're against us. ISIS talks like that. Right, Bilahari, do you have anything to add to that, please?
Yes, as you asked, what are the challenges for small states in era of multipolarity? I think you are confusing two things. The challenge for a small state is always constant. Small states are actually irrelevant in the international system. The strategic imperative or challenge is always to create relevance for yourself. Now, how you do it is another matter, but obviously relevance is situational. And I think multipolarity, and don't forget, it doesn't have to be, every pole doesn't have to be of equal weight, as long as there are more than one pole. I think that's a multipolar situation. Multipolarity is a rather favorable situation for small states, provided certain conditions are met. Right? And the first and most vital condition is a psychological one. A sense of fatalism is generally fatalistic. A sense of fatalism is fatal to small states. And Ambassador, I must say, I heard an echo of that when in your remarks, particularly when you talk of us being the victims of our size. First of all, size is relative, you know. Singapore is certainly physically small, 700 square kilometers. But as a financial center, we are not small. As a logistics hub, we are not small. As a center for R&D and education in our region, we are not small. But of course, you are right, physical size matters, right? You said ideas are very important, and the first idea that is very important, I agree, is that while there are limitations imposed by size, we should not allow those limitations to push us into a sense of powerlessness or fatalism. There is always agency, some degree of agency. In some situations, there will be more agency. In some situations, there may be less. But it is very seldom in my 37 or more years in the Foreign Service, we are entirely without agency. Provided, of course, you have the wit to recognize it and the courage to act by it. That's another matter. Now, in a multipolar situation, I think it maximizes the opportunity, at least, to exercise agency. Because if there's only one pole, if there's only one power, then you have no agency. Obviously, if that power tells you to do something, tells you to jump, your only answer is how high, sir. If there are two powers, you have a little bit more agency, but in a multipolar situation, and the poles don't have to be of equal weight, you have maneuver space, you can exercise agency. And the way you exercise agency is, of course, another matter, and that's a different kind of question. So I think, rather than seeing only, and it is, of course, a more complex situation. You talked about the Cold War, where there were basically only two blocks, right? And you either are on one side or the other side. Even if you pretended to be non-aligned, as both our countries did, you are really, in reality, you are on one side or the other, right? Now I think it's a different situation. It's a different situation because the Cold War was essentially a competition between two systems. Whereas the main axis of the multipolar competition is obviously between US and China. And US and China are both vital components of one system, one global economic system. And they compete within that system to see who will dominate it. Whereas the US and Soviet Union competed to see which system will replace the other one, right? And that actually complements the multipolarity that has already emerged, but really, it's not emerging, it's already here. It complements that in the sense that everybody has an important relationship with the US, everybody has an important relationship with China, economic relationship, and economics and politics is not so neatly disentangled, right? That was not the case in the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. Most of us, except those that were clearly in the Soviet bloc, Eastern Europe in particular, and a few third world countries here and there, had very minimal ties to the other side. And conversely, those of us who are market economies have very few ties to the Soviet Union. Now I think everybody's ties to both China and the United States and in Western Europe and in Asia to India to Japan to South Korea, they are profound in a way that did not exist before. Nobody perhaps trusts either any major power, but you can't do without them. Right? So the choices are no longer binary. For example, talking for Singapore, and I think this is a general Southeast Asian instinct, it is no longer necessary to align all your interests neatly across all domains with one great power or the other. Some of our interests may take us in the direction of the United States. In the case of Singapore, our defense and security interests do. But our economic interests may take us in the direction of China and Japan and South Korea or India or the EU. And I don't see any contradiction between it. It can be managed. It's a more complex situation. But in complexity, there is an opportunity again to exercise agency, provided you are not lulled or coerced into a fatalistic frame of mind where you surrender your agency.
Thank you, Bilahari. Now, I want to show a little bit of empathy to what Clive just shared, because I think here in ASEAN, we try to use the regional organization to counter the larger influence of the bigger states. But over in EU, things might be more different from Malta. I'll give an example, the refugee problem. I see that as a constant pressure put on Malta by the bigger states. We don't have this problem because we don't grant any refugee status to anyone. So Clive, aside from Malta's compassionate willingness to grant refugee status, how much of this is actually pressure coming from the EU, of which Malta is not only a member, but also the smallest member state?
It's a very interesting question. First of all, yes, look, this is a very, the topic we're discussing today is a very, not new topic, but very complicated, because we have to see how it will be evolving, first of all, before I answer your comment. You see, my concern is not economic, multipolar world. I think I have no problem with that. What I don't wish to see is, again, going back to sort of gang wars, proxy wars. And this is the danger I think. Now, I am not sure if this is, if we can avoid this or not. What I don't want is, in my mind, that we, as a small country, we do not give our price very easy. Okay? Because often I think that we have avoided to pass our interest strongly. Let me try and give an example. If you are a small country and you have a banking system, it's constantly under the microscope. But no one talks about Delaware, no one talks about other London cities. So you see, this is where I want to come. You have mentioned now the phenomena we have of phenomena, really, it's no longer a phenomena, of migration. Let me give, and I thank you for this, let me try and illustrate exactly with this example. We have been faced with the problem of irregular migration, or call it what you want, since we became a new member state. And although it is quite overwhelming for us, and we have worked very hard on it, we have not found the support and the visibility we always expected. Now, it so happens that after so many years, migrants are arriving at the border from Belarus. And suddenly, this has been given a lot of visibility, and everyone is talking about it. This is another case in point where I think small countries like mine struggle to get their message across. Now, in the end, we learn the game as well, and in the end, we develop our skills and we find our niche. And we manage to play the system well because, there is an evolution in it's competition, and you find out how to best play the system to your own advantage. So there is advantages in it. I still think, however, that we should not end up being in a position of like pawns in a system. As long as we play the system to our advantage, and as long as we get the dividend of our investment, then that is okay. What I don't want is that a fait accompli. So you end up in this situation because you are not supporting us on this, and you end up here because you are not supporting that. I think, you know what my real problem is we are still, somehow we're still playing 19th and 20th century politics in a 21st century economy. Not to say 22nd century economy, because I think the global economy is light years ahead. If you consider the things we can do today, which we weren't able to do 10 years ago, at the same time we are still playing the rules, the political rules of the last century. Thanks.
Bilahari, do you have any comment on what Clive just said?
Yes, I think, I said, the extent to which you can exercise agency depends on context. And there are many contexts. Multipolarity is one sort of structural context. But the kind of regional environment which you belong to is also very important. There is a very fundamental difference between ASEAN and the EU. ASEAN is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. The EU, I think there are many advantages belonging to the EU, but the EU talks about being talks about being a community of values in many sense. And that, I think, plays to the disadvantage of small states. Even if you happen to share the values, how you implement those values, size matters. You will look at those values somewhat differently if you're a huge country and if you're a small country. I know the EU prides itself on its democratic values, but from my observation over many years, the way it operates in practice is very, among its own members, is far from democratic. And I think that's what the ambassador was very politely alluding to, right? Now ASEAN, but ASEAN is not a community of values. We have never pretended to be. We are an organization based on common interests, and that is very different. Moreover, we work by consensus, right? That means among the 10 of us, there's great disparity in size. Indonesia, for example, is larger than all the other 9 members combined, both in population and land area. But if Indonesia can veto something that it thinks is against its interests, so can Singapore, so can Brunei, which is even smaller in population size than Canada. There are many disadvantages to working by consensus. It's very cumbersome, it's very slow, and sometimes you just cannot take action because you just cannot have consensus. But it preserves the room for agency and autonomy. I think, Ambassador, you mentioned that one of the big problems, one of the big worries you have, which I share, is how to avoid in this new era of, new phase of great power competition, because it has never really gone away, right? To avoid being drawn into being a proxy for one major power or the other. And that's a real concern. However, I think it really depends in the end on the integrity of your system. Right? I know in my part of the world, in Southeast Asia, during the previous period of the Cold War proxy conflicts, those countries that became proxies allowed themselves to either be corrupted or seduced into surrendering their agency, or they did it voluntarily for what seemed to them to be the good reasons, but were wrong reasons. Let me give you an example. Right? Singapore is not a treaty ally of the United States, in the sense we do not expect the United States to trade blood or treasure to defend us, right? We only expect them to sell us the technologically superior weapons with which we can defend ourselves. However, we do expect the United States to maintain the overall balance of power in our region, to stabilize it, and I think it has done quite well over the last 50 years, since the end of the Vietnam War. Because if that overall balance of major powers is unstable, then a small country does not have much room to maneuver. But once it's stable, you can move. So we do what we can to facilitate the overall balance. For example, allowing the US to use our the US military forces to use some of our facilities for some purposes. But we don't expect the US to shed blood or treasure to defend us. We'll defend ourselves. And those countries who have surrendered that part of their agency, the right to self-defense, to any major power, have all regretted it throughout history. Not a single exception. The latest example is the Kabul government. It's just the latest example. No doubt there will be more examples going forward, but this is where we are. So I think it's not such a difficult thing. When I say maintain the integrity of the system, I don't just mean being well governed, but having a very clear idea of your own interests and having the ability to pursue those interests, even when it means running into the opposition of major powers. And that is easier if there's more than one major power present. Right? That's what I said at the very beginning. Right? You balance. Many years ago, look, in Western international relations theory, balancing, hedging, and bandwagoning are kind of presented as if they are alternative strategies. Right? However, the Southeast Asian diplomatic instinct is to do all three simultaneously. On some issues, we may balance. On other issues, we may hedge. On a third issue, we may bandwagon. And we don't have to do all these three things with the same power. We can do it with three different powers. Or we may do it by ourselves with no power. Right? It's a much more complex game, but you would need to have a very tight control of a system. It's harder in the EU, I know, because the EU has a certain supranational ambition. Brussels has a supranational ambition. EU defines itself as a community of values. And values are, very hard to distinguish freedom, my freedom from your freedom. When somebody talks about freedom, argument normally, the room for debate completely narrows. Right? And then your size becomes a disadvantage. But when you talk about interest, you can be a bit more clinical about it.
Thank you, Bilahari. Now I've heard, Bilahari mention now that things are not like past where it's binary, and I've also heard Clive talk about technology. How then can small states like Singapore and Malta leverage technology to not only sustain our visibility, but soft power on the international stage?
Well, I'll go first. I think technology is a mixed blessing. It's a double-edged sword. Right? I think the cyber realm of politics, diplomacy, and even warfare is the future realm. Right? In theory, this is not a realm where size should matter much, but in practice, it does matter much. If your population is only just short of 6 million, or Malta is how much? I'm sorry. Okay, but around. Sorry?
How many?
Okay, if you are 6 million or your Malta size, you obviously cannot deploy a whole army of bots or trolls, which some major powers do, right? Even if they may be non-official. We just don't have the resources. And technology can't solve this all the time. You need, at some point, some human intelligence to do this. On the other hand, insofar as I said at the beginning, the strategic imperative of small states is to make yourself relevant. You cannot take your relevance for granted. In fact, you should start from the premise, I am irrelevant, and how do I make myself relevant? Right? And there technology has a more positive effect. Right? Because it's a very hard fact of life, and it sounds very crass. Small states will always have less options than big states, but rich small states will have more options than poor small states. And technology is The digital economy, the digital future is where size doesn't matter that much to develop a viable and prosperous and advanced economy. Of course, there are other things that have to go into your education system, your value structure, and so on, right? But in principle, in the nuts and bolts kind of manufacturing, you need space. You need a huge labor force. And if you don't have it, well, you can make up for it in certain ways as Singapore did, but there are still limitations. But in the digital technology space, the digital economy, that is not a limitation. The limitation is your ingenuity, your educational system, and a few other factors. So I think, but when you're talking about the darker side of international relations, the ability to wage cyber war, to launch cyber influence operations, well, then I think your size is a disadvantage. Not completely, because there are maybe 5 or 6 countries that are highly sophisticated in cyber operations. The US, Russia, China, Israel, small country, North Korea, small country, and Iran. So out of 6, 2 are small countries. So it's, even there is not a total disadvantage, but both Israel and North Korea, they have certain peculiarities in their environment that have caused them to invest huge amounts in this capability for very understandable reasons, at least in the case of Israel, right? Maybe not all of us will be willing to invest that much, right? Because once you invest in one realm, you have to give up something else. But in principle, I think there are pluses and minuses, but on the whole, if I balance it off, I think the pluses of technological revolutions that are going on even as we speak are beneficial to small states.
Thank you, Bilahari. Clive, would you like to add something to that?
Yeah, sure. What Ambassador Kausikan said is there's a lot of truth. I agree with a lot of what he said, absolutely. Malta will never have the resources to send satellites to space to monitor the world or to eavesdrop. So yes, there is a lot of relativity. I always say that in the Middle Ages, what mattered to be a power was strength and courage. What you needed to do was to invade some village, plunder a village, destroy everything. You have the courage and the ruthlessness. So people talk about you, your meat, and the reputation grows, and people are afraid of you. I think by the First World War, numbers became really important. To have a massive army, to a very strong military, and so on and so forth. By the Second World War, besides numbers, I see technology and financial power, because wars cost money. But now we see, in relative terms, we see technology playing a very primary role in security. And while, my colleague, what he said is absolutely correct, but there is more relativity in technology than I think even in economy. Because you can be a relatively small country, have a few geniuses who would hack, I don't know, the power grid of a country, of another country. And that creates its own problem. So not necessarily, what I'm trying to say is that size becomes even more relative in technology. Now it's true, like everything else, there are advantages and disadvantages. I think, like everything else, and I'm seeing this trend already, is the niche market, where particular countries are establishing themselves. The other question is, at what cost price? Because, as you said, North Korea is developing its own system and so on and so forth, but at what cost price? And would would this be allowed in more free societies, in more free, not necessarily through freedom, but even academic freedom, where this is not imposed, but people participate in the debate. So there is a very important aspect there, Vietnam. Yes, but I think this also, then there is another aspect, because besides these platforms, we still need range. We still need monitoring. Today you can have a drone operating in Clive and being operated in Yerevan, just to invent two countries. And this will require the use of certain infrastructure of other countries. So again, you will find that there has to be some cooperation on the level, and who knows, we will need to have also some treaties on this. The registration of drones, registration of certain artificial intelligence, of robots, and so on and so forth. Like today we have the aviation registry and the maritime register. The time will come where we will have to discuss about these things. And this will bring into the question that more and more rules of engagement. You know, at the end of the day, our international relations are still based on an architecture which belongs to another reality. The Security Council is still the architecture of the Second World War. It's a basic effect. And we all admit that we need to reform this.
Thank you
And
very
yet,
much. Go ahead,
we
please.
find it difficult. Thanks, Lee.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Clive. Now we have just 15 minutes left. I'd like to open up the floor to questions for Q&A. May I check with the host if you have received any questions on your end, please?
Hi, Billy. Thank you for your great panel. I guess I'm going to help you regarding the physical participants, if there are some questions. But I see there is a question from Michael Strauss. Because I assume you don't see or you are not seeing very good the physical participants, yes? Good. You have questions? Yeah, again, there is a question from Michael Strauss.
Michael, would you like to ask the question yourself?
Yes, thank you.
are.
I'm just sinking on the video here. I have to get my head back up above water. Okay, thank you for this wonderful panel, and Your Excellencies, thank you as well, because you made some very interesting comments. And I wanted to address this question to Ambassador Kausikan, but both can answer, of course. When you were talking about the need for small states to make themselves relevant, what is, I would think that one of the primary ways that this can be done in the modern world is by membership in international organizations where small states have certain equality with larger states in terms of things like voting rights, or if decisions have to be taken with unanimity, things like that, that can elevate the voice of small states and influence in broader international events in which all members are part of. And it would seem that the logic would be that the more international organizations a small state joins, the more influence it has on things, the bigger voice it has, simply because its voice is elevated in the context of its constitution or whatever it is. Anyway, I wonder if you could comment on that, please. Thank
I
you.
think that's true, but it's only true to a certain extent. And we should be very clear in our minds about the extents, the limits, about the possibilities of multilateralism belonging to international organization, as well as their limits, right? First of all, I mean, there is a tendency to talk about multilateralism as if it was some kind of magic wand. It isn't. It's one of the tools of statecraft, and for certain times and on certain issues, it may be the appropriate tool. But it's not going to be the appropriate tool for all things, for all time, right? So you have to be very clear about that. Secondly, international organizations, I agree with Ambassador Clive, that, you know, the UN system, for example, at least the New York organs of the UN system, are based on a configuration of power that was obsolete even when at the UN's birth, right? You know, why are France and Britain considered major powers? Are they considered major because they are among the victors of the Second World War? But the Second World War left both of them prostrate and they have never quite recovered. So today we consider them great powers because they are permanent members of the Security Council. They're not permanent members of the Security Council because they are great powers. It's the logic has been completely upended, you know. So, all right. So these organizations not only may or may not be the appropriate instrument for the problem or the tool facing your country at hand, but they also they also operate unequally. You know this. You know, the Security Council is where the principle of sovereign equality is most deeply embedded. The Security Council, most of the time, is practically, I wouldn't say totally irrelevant, but largely irrelevant. Right? It allows you to have a voice. It allows you to articulate your ideas. But do not forget that even the most brilliant insight of a small country can be ignored if inconvenient. Whereas the most foolish idea of a big country has to be taken seriously. And in fact, I would say, in fact, the more stupid the idea, the more seriously you must take it because of the damage they can do. Right? So this is an unequal world, but you do have agency. And multilateral institutions, international organizations, are one tool for exercising that agency, but it's not the only tool, nor is it a magic wand that solves all your problems.
Thank you very much, Bilahari. May I check with the host if there's any question on the floor? If not, I'm going to ask my last burning question.
I guess there's a question from the audience.
Okay, yes, please give it to me.
Thank you very much. This is Narek Sukesan from Yerevan State University, and my question would be about, deriving from Singapore's example, the very famous phrase by its leader saying that in a world where the big fish eat small fish and the small fish eat shrimp, Singapore must become a poisonous shrimp. As a foreign policy strategy, I guess, of small states. My question would be what would you suggest to the small states who are not technologically advanced or don't have the strategic importance of being a poisonous shrimp? And if the analogy was not clear, I'm speaking about Armenia, which is in a pool with pretty major and aggressive sharks, but does not really seem to be able to be that poisonous to distract them.
Well, yeah, I think the general point is still valid, but the application of the general point is, of course, as with everything, contextual. If you are Armenian, you live in a far worse neighborhood than we live in. That is a fact, an unfortunate fact of life, right? But the general point is still valid. You have to be able to defend yourself. Whether your strategy is one of a poisonous shrimp, a porcupine, you have to be able to impose costs. In fact, we have moved on in Singapore beyond the strategy of poisonous shrimp. If we get into trouble with any of our neighbors, we intend not just to give them a stomachache, but to prevail, to kill them. Right? And they know it, and therefore deterrence is established. But I said in my opening remarks, we know the limits. We can defend ourselves in our own neighborhood. But that's only within a broader context where the overall balance of forces in our region is relatively stable, and that's beyond our capability. We can facilitate. We believe, and we are not shy of saying so, that the US is going to be a vital, irreplaceable element in that overall balance. So while we do not expect the US to defend us, we do what we can to facilitate the presence of the US in our region by allowing them the use of our facilities, by defense cooperation and security cooperation at different times. Now that option is much more difficult in Armenia simply because of the neighborhood you live in, right? Which is a tougher neighborhood than our neighborhood. But I think the general principle holds true. You need to have the capability to defend yourself. And that, I think, as Ambassador Clive pointed out, involves trade-offs. The money you spend on guns obviously cannot be spent on butter. Right? And the money you spend on guns is totally unproductive in the sense it doesn't produce returns. But I always consider it, in the case of Singapore, which we have a huge defense budget anyway, relative to our size, is an insurance policy. It's the premium you pay for insurance. Insurance is not a productive investment, but you will regret it when you don't have it.
Thank you very much, Bilahari. Now, just few minutes to close, I just want to ask this one last burning question. I'd like to know from both ambassadors, what is it like representing a tiny state in a huge nation? I know countries only send their best and brightest to the big critical country, so both of you are clearly cream of the crop. But regardless, what was it like and what is it like representing a small state in a huge country?
Go ahead.
Clive, would you like to go? Yeah.
Sure, it's like share some experiences. Look, it doesn't, first of all, in our first round I said that what really matters are the ideas. I think that I could add to it that the size of the country is relative to those representing it. Okay? By this I mean that, look, if you're prepared, if you go to meetings prepared, if you know what you want, if you're very clear in your mind, then you will get results. And there is a niche for everyone. You see, the interests of the big countries, after all, are not directly our own interests. Our interests might be different, they might be somewhere else. So there is space. Of course, the problem is resources, you have to fight for, you have to be an all-rounder, while a big country would have 6 or 7 advisors with him. You have to be much more up-to-date. But let me assure you, there were, all of my career, there were no cases where I felt that I was missing out. It's your objectives, I think. You still make contacts, you still make connections, you chase your interests, and I think at the end of the day, all things said and done, I think that yes, we do get our job done.
Thank you very much, Clive. Now, Bilahari, what was it like for you being ambassador for Singapore to Russia?
I'll give you a slightly different perspective, right? When I was head of the Singapore Foreign Service, I used to tell young officers to remember one thing, right? If our foreign policy has been successful, it is not only because of their good looks, not only because of their natural charm, not only because of their brilliant intellects, but because they represent a successful country. And you cannot possibly conduct a successful foreign policy off a barren rock. If you represent a barren rock, no matter how good looking, how charming, and how brilliant you are, you will fail. But I think neither Malta nor Singapore are barren rocks, and so I think I share the ambassador's experience. We get the job done.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you for the generosity of the sharing of your time and expertise. And thank you to our host, Russian Armenian University and IPSA. Thank you for your very kind invitation. We hope to see you again next year. Thank you.
A pleasure. Goodbye.
Thank you very much for the great panel. Thank you.